Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I think we'll go ahead and get started because I don't want to keep people for too long. Could you just let me know if you can hear me okay? Great, thanks. So thanks for joining us today on this webinar with David Robertson on graphic education and using graphic novels in the classroom. This is the second webinar that we've done designed for our teachers. So we hope you enjoy these, and the recordings will be made available online as well. So if you have anyone else that you think might be interested, we'll certainly circulate the link around after as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started because we're going to try to keep this to half an hour. So I'm going to pass it over to David, and he's got a presentation for us. And as you can see, there's a chat window there. So if you do have any questions, we'll have time at the end to go through those, and you can just type them in the chat window, and we'll go through those. So I'm going to pass it over to David. David is a Winnipeg-based novelist and author of novels The Life of Helen Betty Osborne, the 7 Generation series, and Sugar Falls, a residential story. And he's had, I think, some really great success in bringing graphic novels to a really broad audience, and particularly in the classrooms as well. So I'm going to pass it over to David now.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I would ask how everyone's doing, but you cannot answer me, so I won't be able to hear it. This is new for me. I usually do this in front of people, so now I have a microphone in front of me, so I'll try and see how this goes. I usually do this for about 2 hours or an hour and a half, so I'm going to try and condense it by 1/10 and do it for 20 minutes. And I'm just really pleased to be here, and I'll just get started. So, presentation's about the graphic novel, which I am a writer of, and how we can use them in the classroom effectively, and the benefits of using them in the classroom for various reasons. So, I guess the first thing to look at is what a graphic novel is. And this is a question that I often get. And I think it's good to start off with kind of defining the graphic novel. And probably one of the best definitions out there that I like to reference is by Will Eisner. And Will Eisner, who actually wrote the first graphic novel, the first coined graphic novel, said that, as you can see here, there's sequential art, which is really arranging words and pictures in sequence to tell a story or to kind of illustrate an idea. And sequential art is really kind of a big family. The graphic novel is one member of that family. I would say the comic book is the graphic novel's little brother. And then you have things like manga, the Sunday morning comic strips. But it's not just those kind of modern forms of the sequential art medium. Sequential art is a old way of telling stories. It's actually how we used to tell stories when everything started, when we first started to communicate. And you could see sequential art in the petriforms that are in the white shell, in wall paintings, on caves, on birch bark bitings. Those are all forms of sequential art. So just as a kind of a start off, that's kind of what the graphic novel is. Quickly, another question I often get is, what's the difference between the graphic novel and the comic book? And that's a good question. What I would say is that the graphic novel is typically a longer or thicker volume than the comic book, and it is a complete story. The comic book is generally serialized, and the graphic novel is generally a complete story. So that's kind of the differences between the two. Graphic novels are often, the term graphic novels are often used because it's such a popular term these days. So using the term graphic novel makes your project cool right off the start. And so mine are graphic novels because they are cool, and other reasons too. So quickly, if you're looking at the screen here, the elements of the graphic novel, just to go over, and this is true of the comic book also. You can see here words and pictures in sequence. Your eyes naturally start at the left, down, and then to the right, down, and then to the right. Unless you're manga, which you read it backwards, in which case you'd read it from the right to the left, and the pictures would be sequenced that way. Some elements of the graphic novel, as you can see on the top left there, that's a thought bubble. Some of the conversations in the middle there are speech bubbles. You have captioning, which is usually the narration. And then you have other elements such as facial expressions, juxtaposition. As you can see, both pages are beside each other, have similar panel layouts and similar actions within the panels. I use that often to show how, in this case, how the past and the present are kind of connected. And it asks the reader to draw kind of conclusions as to what are the relationships between the past and the present. And certainly with a lot of my graphic novel writing, I look at how the past impacts us today and what that means for us. So that's kind of some of the elements. Another thing I'd just like to point out quickly is the space between the panels, which we call the gutters. And my colleague Negon Sinclair often says the reader exists in the gutters, and that's not a knock. But what it means is that the reader draws meaning from the images and the words and kind of connects everything in those white spaces. So they're a very important element of the graphic novel. It's where we draw meaning from everything. Some milestones for you, and you can read it here, so I'm not going to kind of dictate everything to you, but the first comic book, earliest known comic book, and that is on the page, we're not talking about obviously wall paintings or anything here, is The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, which is in 1837. The first coined graphic novel, as I mentioned, was a graphic novel called A Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories, which was in 78. The graphic novel that really brought the graphic novel into the spectrum of being a respected form of literature is Mouse, and I'm sure some of you out there may have read Mouse before. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 92. The graphic novel came out in 86, and if you haven't read it, what it does is looks at the Holocaust using cats as Nazis and mice for Jewish people, and it's an incredible graphic novel. So why graphic novels? Why do I use them? How are they so great for education? Cutting to the chase. I'm checking the time here just to make sure I'm not getting behind on myself. But the graphic novel for me, quickly, originally weren't so many technical answers for me. The graphic novel for me was something I grew up with, and it was something that I really felt could connect in a meaningful way and an engaging way with youth. It was a personal thing at first for me. I mean, I grew up really detached from my culture. I grew up with a very, very much a broken identity. My parents separated very early on in my life. I grew up in River Heights. Very soon after we moved into River Heights, my parents broke apart. And so my dad, who is the treaty of my parents, my mom is English and Irish. My mom raised us, and so there wasn't very good kind of reference for her to raise Aboriginal children, teaching them about their culture and their history in any kind of a meaningful way. I had a good upbringing, but I lacked that. And certainly going to Brockcorden, River Heights, and Calvin High School, they were all schools that did not have a high Aboriginal concentration of students, and at that time, history wasn't at the level to really teach anything meaningful or significant about Aboriginal people. So long story short, I was in a place where I did not feel good about being Aboriginal, did not have any real strong sense of identity. My parents got back together in grade 11, and so all of a sudden my dad was thrust back into my life. And everything about my dad kind of came into conflict with the stereotypes that I had learned. And all of a sudden, I got to know this man who was quite successful, who was respected, who was a great educator, and he was Aboriginal. And so it really caused me to take a second look at, what are these stereotypes? What do they mean? Are they true? And let's put them up against somebody who is Aboriginal, and let's put it to the acid test. for me, things didn't add up. And so I started to learn more about the culture and the history for the first time in a meaningful way, and eventually came to the point where I felt very good about being Aboriginal, and certainly could come in front of a crowd and say, I'm an Aboriginal person, my family comes from Norway House, and it was a really great moment for me. That was about 2005. And that's around the time where I thought, what could have changed for me, and what could I do to sort of help more youth coming up learn real things, meaningful things, significant things that it would engage with them about Aboriginal history, about Aboriginal culture. And so, again, the graphic novel was what I kind of gravitated to, because that's what I grew up on. I would stay up late at night reading comic books with a flashlight. I have thousands of them in a cardboard box in my basement. And I thought, wow, what if we could really, give a kid a textbook that was a comic and say, here, you can learn from this. I think students would get very excited about that, and that's what's happened. So some technical reasons, why graphic novels? So first, how can they be used to educate? One of the more obvious reasons would be to teach some literary devices. And so within the pages of the graphic novel, and certainly most of these apply to my graphic novel series, you'll see things like, teaching about, settings, plot, character development, foreshadowing, allegory, irony, flashbacks, metaphors, symbolism, imagery. So this is really displaying that the graphic novel itself has very close relationship to literature, to novels that don't have pictures in them. Again, they are a very respected form of literature, and so can be used just as well as a novel in teaching about literature and literary devices. Moving on. They go beyond just teaching about literature and literary devices, of course. They educate students about things like social values, roles, stereotypes, history, which will pique many of your ears out there. And certainly I kind of exist in the world of history, contemporary issues, cultural awareness, and even math. So you might think we're stretching here a little bit, but I'm going to show you some examples of how the graphic novel teaches these things. First, looking at some of the genres of the graphic novel. Now, one of the questions I get often, and certainly when the Helen Osborne Memorial Foundation approached me to do writing for them, and I said, why don't we do a comic book about Helen Osborne? And they first said, there's no way we're letting you do a comic book about Helen Osborne. The perception, of course, being that the comic books were about superheroes. They were cartoony. And it took some convincing to show that's not actually the case. There's a lot of precedents out there that show how strong the graphic novel and the comic book can be in teaching other things, and they're not just superheroes. Here's some examples. Again, superhero at the top there, this is in no particular order, by the way, but you get teaching about science fiction, history again there, realistic fiction, biography. There's lots of great biographies out there in the graphic novel format, manga, humor, romance, political commentary, and the list goes on. What are some examples? So you want to teach social studies. How about teaching about the Islamic Revolution? You can pick up Persepolis or Persepolis 2 to do that. You want to teach someone about 9/11 and what happened there. There was a graphic novel that came out that was written by many of the kind of biggest graphic novelists out there that told stories about 9/11 through the perspective sometimes of superheroes, but really touched on incredible and real images and ideas from 9/11. 300, now we might be stretching a bit here. 300 takes some artistic liberties with history, you could say, but it's still a graphic novel that is about a real time in history. Again, Mouse. King is a good graphic novel about Martin Luther King by a gentleman by the name of Ho Chi Anderson. And Riel. Now, Riel is an incredibly well-written graphic novel. It's probably one of the best regarded graphic novels out there, along with Mouse and along with Watchmen, which is a superhero one, but it is kind of the landmark graphic novel. Teaching about culture. So the thing is right now about Aboriginal culture, there's not a lot of graphic novels out there that teach culture and history related to Aboriginal people. This is one that I found that I'm looking forward to reading, but it goes over some Native American tales in comic book format. Now here we go. You want to teach math, your kids aren't excited about math? How about introducing them to a comic book first and get them excited about statistics? Now, if I had this when I was younger, maybe I would have been better at math and statistics. Unfortunately, it wasn't around then, but there you go. Science, so how about teaching about evolutionary biology? This is a graphic novel about Darwin taking a walk and having conversations with mites in his eyebrow about the concept of evolution. To balance it out, lots of graphic novel, comic book interpretations and adaptations of the Bible. Now, these are a great series of graphic novels, not as good as my series of graphic novels. That's a joke. But this is from the Healthy Aboriginal Network. They have lots of great issues, graphic novels that have sold thousands of copies across Canada, dealing with gang violence, diabetes, gambling addictions, and so on and so forth, including suicide. It is a great series. Teaching literature and teaching the classics, introducing students to a comic book about The Hobbit, getting them excited about reading The Hobbit is a great thing to do to give them a step into the classics. So some of the, I say, the top 5 reasons why graphic novels work so well. First of all, as a motivational tool, they are incredible. I call graphic novels the great motivator. Now, they work amazingly well with struggling readers, as you all know, and I know, are boys. I was one of them, that's how I know. I did not want to read it all when I was young, but there I was devouring comic books, and through that, learning a lot of great reading skills that helped me to graduate to more sophisticated texts. They work great with students who are English as a second language. They work well with readers who are typically hard to reach, which again are boys. So boys here obviously are greatly serviced by the comic book. What about girls and those more sophisticated readers? They also work incredibly well with those as well. The reason being is that comic books, and I'll use the example of the 7 Generation series here, have very complex narrative structures and engaging plots that reach and engage with sophisticated readers just as well as they can engage with struggling readers. It sounds incredible, but it's true. The best example I can give of that is with the Helen Osborne graphic novel. I've been out to a grade 4 class and speaking with those students, and I've been out with the same graphic novel to a university level class. Both get something out of it, both learn from it, and it's really an amazing thing, and I don't think anything else can do that as well as the graphic novel. One study that was done just to kind of bookend the motivating part, study done in the 1940s where a group of English teachers were given Superman comic books that taught language arts, and they were asked to report on their experience in teaching with the comic book at the end of a week. One of the comments from one of the teachers was that it gave her the annoying problem of finishing a whole week's worth of work in one night. 75% or so of the teachers found great use and motivation from the students in using the comic book. So pretty cool study. The second reason is that they're visual. Now, as you all know, youth today more and more are becoming visual learners. So the graphic novel, as a member kind of the visual medium, speak to our youth today. But they also connect to how we used to communicate, and I mentioned that before. It's an anciently established truth that we connect with visuals. It's how we used to communicate. We used to kind of communicate through pictures before we could think with words. So they're great in that way. Another study that was done by a guy named Sonez in the 40s, he took 500 students, he divided them in two, he gave one half a textbook, the other half a comic book, and tested them on it after a week. They were on the same subject, the same topic, and they found that the students who learned from the comic book scored incredibly higher than those who had learned with the textbook. He switched it around just to make sure that it wasn't a fluke, and the students who were then given a comic book at the end of the week, tested again, and tested incredibly high. So they work very well. The concept of them being permanent, for example, me lecturing you right now is me dictating the pace of learning to you. Similarly, if you show a student a movie, the movie dictates pace to the student. If you show a student a novel or textbook and ask them to learn from it, it does have permanence in that the student dictates the pace of learning for themselves, but it lacks the visual. So with a graphic novel, it contributes visual permanence to learning. They dictate their own pace of learning, which empowers them. It also gives them images to links to the words, and the pictures and words shoulder the burden of the story together, and that makes learning far more effective. While this might be self-explanatory, they're popular right now. They're probably more popular than ever. It seems like every other movie coming out right now is based on a graphic novel or comic book property. Aside from that, the comic book and the graphic novel also are a connection to youth to popular culture, so they work in that way as well. Finally, they're good as an intermediary tool, and we've touched on that a little bit, but they are a good foundational piece of learning, of education. So you want a student to learn or read The Hobbit, you give them the comic book based on The Hobbit, and you'll find that they'll want to read The Hobbit afterwards. You want them to learn more about statistics, give them that comic book on math, and I think that you find that they'll do better at statistics. So they function in that way. The other way that they function is by getting a student to actually do their own graphic novel or their own comic book, and that builds skills beyond just reading. And I'll give you a quick example of that. So what does it look like for a student to create a piece of sequential art? Well, they have to do all of these things, okay? So they're conceptualizing their stories, they're writing the summary of it, they're researching it, they're scripting it out, developing storyboards, doing the final illustrations, adding in captions and dialogue, and then doing some pre-publication work on that piece. So as history teachers, having students develop comic books based on a historical figure would teach them about history, but would also do a whole ton of other stuff. So quickly going through what does a concept look like. Here's my original concept for 7 Generations. As you can see, it's a very kind of high-level summary of what the series is going to be about. By the way, if anybody wants this presentation, I can email it out afterwards. Here's what a synopsis would look like. So I condensed this a little bit. The synopsis was about a page or a page and a half, but it's just a very detailed summary of the graphic novel. This is book 2 of the 7 Generations series. Doing research, now for me, this is all the research I did. Now obviously your students aren't going to travel on a plane, unless they're older students, I guess. But all this research lends itself to writing a historical graphic novel much more effectively. Obviously, research is a huge piece of that. So reading history books, elder consultation, and doing residential school survivor interviews, that's for me. Researching the genre itself to see what's been done and what hasn't. So originally we wanted to do a Louis Riel graphic novel. We saw that the one that's been done on Louis Riel is probably one of the best graphic novels ever, so we thought maybe we shouldn't do Riel again. So we did Helen by Osborne. I think we did a pretty good job. And then for me, it was researching some oral stories as well and incorporating that into the storytelling of the 7 Generations series. Writing a script. So for me, writing a script is a lot like writing a movie or a TV script. And as you can see here, breaking down panel by panel, line by line, all the captions, all the dialogue. And it requires a lot of visualization, and then translating the visuals in your head onto paper. So it's a very difficult skill. I find one of the questions I got last week was, what's harder, writing a book or writing a graphic novel script? And for me, writing a graphic novel script is quite a bit harder. So there's what a storyboard would look like. So artists in the classroom, partnering them up with someone who can write, or finding a student who can do both, which I cannot do. Would be great. That goes into the final illustrations, adding in your captions, your dialogue, your speech bubbles, and then all that pre-publication work. So you're not going to obtain critical reviews, obviously, but paginating them, getting into some graphic design, layout, editing, which is copy editing, making sure all the grammar and everything like that is working properly, is all stuff that the students can do. In the end of it, they have a comic in their hands, which they feel really great about. But they also are learning all of these things here just from doing a comic book. So they're developing reading and writing skills, research skills, drawing, digital technology, filmmaking skills. As I said, for me, writing a graphic novel script is a lot like writing a screenwriting for a movie or TV. But also for me, the process of writing the graphic novel and working with the illustrator is very much akin to, I look at myself as the director, the screenwriter, and I see the illustrator as the cinematographer and the actors. And, working with an illustrator is also develops teamwork skills. As you can see there, working with others, some graphic design skills, and then, of course, learning in the subject that you're writing about. So cultural awareness, science, math, literature, and history, of course. So just as a quick summary, some of the things that graphic novels help students to do, increasing literacy, developing language skills, fostering an interest in different literary genres, a broad range of topics, stimulating imagination, developing an appreciation of art and being able to talk about art, and deriving meaning from visual phenomenon, and understanding pop culture and media. Here are some of the graphic novels that I've done. Now, we don't have a ton of time, but these comic books themselves tell stories about history, and through that history, students learn a variety of different things. Now, the Helen Osborne graphic novel will teach you about missing and murdered Aboriginal women, the residential school system. They'll teach you about justice and Aboriginal people's treatment by the justice system. They'll even teach you about geography and a whole bunch of different things, segregation, the list goes on. Seven Generation series looks at 4 different times in history, and each of those books teach different things. So the first book, Stone, was a way for me to dispel kind of the view of the Aboriginal person as being savage back then. So it talks about the sophistication about how we used to live, governance, games, family structure, subsistence, all of that. Book 2 looks at the smallpox epidemics and how oral stories are integral to how we pass down history. Book 3 is about the residential school system, and Book 4 is about reconciliation. What does that mean? What does that look like? And again, the broader kind of topic of what is history's impact on us today, and how does learning about history help us move forward to tomorrow? Sugar Falls is, again, a more in-depth look at the residential school system. Here for you, as teachers out there, are curriculum correlations for my graphic novel series. This means more to you than probably to me, but they are things that I definitely try to hit upon when I'm writing these. In fact, the next series I'm working on, which is a series on historical figures in Aboriginal history, my publisher gave me these correlations, not these ones in particular, and said, write a story that hits upon this curriculum. And so that's what I did. And so, as I make a joke about the technical teaching stuff that, means more to me, but, I do fashion the things I do and the things I write around curriculum so that it can be used in the classroom more effectively. Some references for you. Teaching with Graphic Novels is a great book that's available through my publisher. Teaching Art, Complete Guide for the Classroom, talks about some storyboarding techniques. There's a teacher's guide developed for 7 Generations and for the life of Helen Osborne. And then, of course, you should all go out and buy my books because they're the best graphic novels out there. I'm joking, but you should actually get them because they're very good for the classroom. Also, there's a link there to watch an instructional video that I did through my publisher that talks about the process of developing the graphic novel. And I did my hair that day, so I was presentable. Luckily now I'm not on camera. That's another joke. So here's some contact information for you if you want to get in touch with me in other ways, my email and my phone, as well as my... And I think we have a few minutes now. If there are some questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you. So thanks for sticking on the internet and listening, and I'll answer some questions if there are some out there. Gotta wait for people to chat on the bottom there. If there aren't any questions, that's fine too. Well, I do see some nice comments on the chat window, so thank you for those. And if there aren't any questions, you can always email me with them as well. Oh, here's one by Mike coming in. Oh, okay, so how many attempts did it take to get your first novel right? That's a difficult one to answer, only because, you know, I work with an editor, and so with the 7 Generations one, it probably, you know, would be 6 to 8 edits for every script. For Helen Osborne, it was probably more than that, because that one we actually self-published. So it was, you know, probably, I don't know, 9 to 10 different iterations of the story, and then it would be looking at the storyboards and how they kind of interplay with the words and making sure that the script and the storyboard and the illustrations work together. So the whole process for writing the Helen Osborne graphic novel took about, I would say, 3 to 4 months. Mike? You know, what I would do, Mike, and so that's a really good question. And I've seen teachers getting their students to do the comic books. I think all you really need to do to get them to start off is give them a topic in which to kind of form a story around. When I do writing classes, I often, you know, kind of peak the writing by, you know, getting them, you know, giving them a little bit of a push. So a question I often ask is, you know, what's your earliest memory? And then, you know, forming a story around that. So writing often memories are kind of, if you've seen Inception, you'll know, dreams and memories are the same thing in that sometimes we know the middle, but we forget the ending and the beginning. So getting them to kind of fashion a story around that, writing the beginning, writing the ending, and really just getting them to kind of move that pen along the paper. But in terms of writing a comic book, it's kind of the same thing. So, you know, who's interested in writing, who's interested in drawing, putting those teams together, and then having them, you know, fashion a story around either, you know, a piece of history, a historical figure or a historical event, or, you know, a story that they want to tell themselves, and just, you know, putting them through that process of that development. And, you know, students get really excited about that. From what I've seen, is just, you know, this is what we're doing. You get to write and draw your own comic book. I think most students would think that's really cool. Any ideas about a good number of pages for a first graphic novel at school? Because of the time it takes to put into it, I would probably go more than 5 pages to start. And certainly 5 pages could work well for a kind of a shorter story. But, you know, if you're going to go out to 10 to 15, you're going to have to devote a significant amount of class time to it. So I would say, you know, probably between 3 to 5 pages, even just getting to do a kind of a sequence, an action sequence around a story could take a couple of pages, but the process itself will give them all those skills, and that's really important. But I wouldn't go probably more than 5 pages to start. I think you can get a good historical event across in 5 pages. I don't know about, like, you certainly couldn't tell a story, like you couldn't tell a story about Batosh in 5 pages, for example. But you could, you know, tell a story that happens within a piece of history in 5 pages that talks about some of those elements in the history, and maybe will encourage students to go kind of learn more about that history. You know, in Stone, for example, the actual history piece is about half the graphic novel, so 15 pages. But I could probably condense that into 5 for you know, elementary, junior high level, and talk a lot about the history, enough to get some of the concepts of it and the learnings of it across to a student. So I think it's just pick your history and make it kind of manageable. Okay. Well, thank you everybody out there for your questions and for listening. I had a great time. This is new for me, and this was, really exciting to sit at a monitor and interact with people. Even though I can't see you, I'm sure you're all lovely people.
Thanks so much, everyone, for attending, and I want to thank David very much for coming out. He actually came to our office here in Winnipeg, so not only did he have to try to do a presentation over the internet, he had to put up with me sitting here just sort of staring at him. So, definitely do go check out his website and purchase his books. They really are amazing books and excellent tools for the classroom, and really readers of all ages, as he said. So I do encourage you to check them out. And just because we were talking about writing graphic novels, I will put a plug for our Kayak Kids Illustrated History Challenge that we run here. So if your kids graphic novels or graphic stories, look that up. I'll send out the information as well, and they can win a pretty great prize as well. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, David, as well.